Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you're in ethics and compliance, legal, HR, if you're in any function that's a guardian of the culture and trying to improve your workplace, this is the place to be. We got a great episode for you guys today. This one's going to be awesome, actually. We are talking about unlocking the secret chats, unseen risks in messaging apps. This is, everybody's talking about it. There's been some recent action on this, which we will be diving in and talking about. And yeah, so stay tuned, get your notebooks out, and let's get moving here. So our official Linktree is live. Hit your QR code or just go to official Ethico on Linktree. And this is a list of all the things that Ethico does. We put out a ton of content. We try to add value to this marketplace because we're really at this interesting inflection point. The next 5 years are going to look way different than the last 15 years. And it's up to you to elevate your program and elevate your impact in your organization to really drive that culture of integrity, authentic integrity, to the hearts and minds of the people in your company. So sign up for the Ethicsverse on top. Everybody should be on your other screen. You should be on the Linktree right now, and you should be signing up for all these things. You should be following us on LinkedIn. Follow me if you like. Go to the Ethico homepage and book a demo if you're interested. Our hotline benchmark report is still ripping through the community. A lot of great insights there, so encourage you to download that. And round of applause for Chase. He's got our YouTube page popping. We have 1,000 subscribers so far. We're trying to get that to 100,000. I want to have one of those cool plaques behind me soon. So sign up there. We have YouTube Shorts. We put all of our webinars up there, all of our podcasts, and so forth. Today, so this week, everyone's been talking about this. If you have been on LinkedIn over the last couple of days and are in any of the compliance groups or just following folks in compliance, everybody's talking about this new book. Mary Shirley's book just dropped hot off the presses, I think like a day or two ago. So it's called Level Up. It's got 65 hacks and cheats. I'm about halfway through it. It's freaking great. So I'm going to sound a lot smarter now because I'm going to be stealing a lot of techniques and tips from this book. And we're giving away 5 today. Okay, we're giving away 5 of these books. You can pick the Kindle version or you can pick the hard copy. But this is always going to be for the people that are the most, give the most participation. But I'm sorry, it's only limited to Ethicsverse members. So if you go to that Linktree and we'll drop in the chat how to sign up, please. And you can sign up for the Ethicsverse, and then these are going to be on your calendar every week, and you can just show up whenever you can. So 5 of those are coming. As I'm rambling through our announcements, go ahead and drop into the chat your LinkedIn. Your LinkedIn URL. We say every week your network is your net worth. Both should be bigger. And we have a very collegial community. I'm trying to drive everybody to take advantage of that fact and trying to drive you to reach out to people across the aisle, reach out to people in other organizations that have had the same kind of challenges that you might be having right now. And I guarantee you they're going to be willing to spend a little time with you and share those tips. You have to take advantage of this so you're not reinventing all these wheels on your own. Everybody is fighting the same fight in their organization, and everybody is more than happy to help. So let's take advantage of that. Compliance Week is coming up. This Compliance Week guide we're putting together is really cool. It's going to be launching soon. It's packed full of games, activities, things that you can do. You can, unabashedly steal, implement in your organization. You got to be thinking about Compliance Week. It's like less than 90 days away. You got to be thinking about how can I use this as a launch point to create some leverage in my organization to raise some awareness around the ethics and compliance function and get more people engaged. Our level of engagement throughout our organization is directly correlated with the impact that we can have. Also, we are giving away custom benchmark reports to Ethicsverse attendees. So if you're interested in that, please drop a 0 in the chat. Someone will reach out to you today or tomorrow and get that scheduled. We get a little bit of data from you. We go through the top 6 or 7 benchmark report data points, map those against our benchmark, map those against the status quo benchmark, and give you some customized tips on how you can improve those numbers. That's something that you can file away, you can share with your team, or even share with your board if you're blowing the doors off of it. So drop that 0 in the chat if you're interested. Ecosystem. We had a kind of an emergency. We had a demo this week and we had to call the ambulance for somebody because they had a heart attack when they saw how great the data analytics platform is. People are loving this. It's a super flexible platform. It's a next-gen platform. Marketing and sales should not have all the cool tools. So if you're frustrated with your tool, if you're frustrated with your vendor and you'd like to see what else is out there, I think it's your ethical responsibility to at least see what's out there. Drop a 1 in the chat or go to the homepage and book a demo. Also, if your homepage on your browser is not radical compliance, are you even in the compliance game? This is Matt Kelly's world famous blog. He puts out more content than anybody. He's on a couple of podcasts. So go to that homepage right now, radicalcompliance.com, and sign up for the coolest newsletter in compliance. If I ever sound smart, it's because I've probably listened to the Compliance in the Weeds podcast or perused Radical Compliance blog. So he is the consummate thought leader and the one and only coolest guy in compliance. The floor is yours, Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. And everybody should know I did not put Nick up to any of what he had just said.
It's all authentic. It's all authentic. Okay.
I appreciate that. So hello to everybody who's joining us today. And I see we have a steady stream of people popping in where they are from or their LinkedIn URLs in the chat. We always love to see that. We are here today to talk about messaging apps and the sort of compliance risks that they pose to large organizations, and then how would you actually get your hands around these compliance risks? Because honestly, there is no perfect foolproof solution to eradicate improper use of messaging apps. So we have a couple of good people here to talk with us about that. First, of course, we do have Nick joining us as always, but also we have hailing from Geneva in Switzerland, Mike Hallback. So Mike is a former compliance advisor at Cargill, where he had actually worked on trading compliance. And that's important, not trade compliance about sanctions or whatnot, trading, because Cargill is a big agribusiness and they do a lot of commodities trading. And commodity and financial trading firms are a big part of this conversation right now. So Mike, you're joining us, and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Mike, I gave you a little beard in that pic. How do you like it? Sorry, go ahead.
I will drink it later.
Also joining us is Maria Davanzo, who most recently was the compliance evangelist at Traliant, and was a longtime chief compliance officer at Cushman & Wakefield, the real estate firm. So Maria, thank you for joining us and having you on too.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
So I want to cover a couple of different things with our speakers and with all the attendees. And certainly for everybody listening, when you do have comments you want to make or questions to ask, you can just pop them right into the chat box or submit them on the Q&A function. In theory, we save up our questions for the end, but in practice, if you do ask a good question or make a good comment, I'll probably just put it to Mike and Maria and Nick right away. But we want to talk about, as I said, how much is this risk for real for most companies? Because that depends on if you are a broker-dealer or commodities trader. That's one level of risk. If you're everybody else, it's a different sort of a risk. But number two, how then do you assess what your compliance program response should be? Are you going to deal with employees bringing their own devices to work? Are you going to have technical controls? Are you going to have policies and procedures to persuade them not to do this, even though they might do it anyways? How do you handle that? So we've got a lot of technology issues. We've got a lot of policy and procedure issues. We've got a lot of training issues to talk about. And I'm looking to get to all of that. My very first question, and maybe Maria, I'll put it to you first, and then to Mike, and then to Nick, is really how much should most companies worry about this, or how should we think about it? Because broker-dealers, and I'll get into them maybe a bit in a few minutes, but broker-dealers have a certain higher set of expectations. That's why when we see enforcement actions about messaging apps, it's always a broker-dealer firm. So there may be some people on the call wondering, why am I supposed to care about this? I'm not a broker-dealer. I'm not trading in orange juice futures or something like that. I'm in some other industry. Why are we still all talking about this? Maria, what do you think first, and then Mike, and then Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So look, I come at this from a very interesting perspective because I was a chief compliance officer at a broker-dealer, and I was a chief compliance officer at a registered investment advisor, registered with the SEC, before I joined Cushman & Wakefield, which was a corporate compliance job. So I sort of have both perspectives. The broker-dealer world there are very specific rules that address this issue, and the reasons for those rules are to protect investors, really, at the end of the day, right? But that doesn't mean that corporations should not be worried about this issue as well. And recently, there are two items that came out of the DOJ. One is the Monaco memo, the Stephanie Monaco memo from September of 2022 that addresses messaging apps and the way companies deal with them. And the other is the updated DOJ guidance from March of 2023, which very specifically included in the investigations section expectations with respect to corporate compliance programs, looking at and weaving into their program, a way to handle the risks that are associated with messaging apps. So while there may be different reasons and different motivators in the broker-dealer world and in the corporate compliance world, I think corporate compliance professionals should be worried about this issue in their organizations as well.
All right. And Mike, give me your thoughts as well about why this is an issue that goes beyond broker-dealers and commodity traders.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it in the following way. So compliance is reflecting how is the compliance program working for you. So how is the people behaving, your employees are behaving, and how is the behavior aligned with what you're expecting to align? So that is the expression of it. And then obviously, this is happening irrespectively, as Maria alluded to. There are some registered firms who have special requirements. Even you so don't have them, you still may be in your operation talking to those people, and obviously it's reflecting on you how you are. And therefore, it doesn't really matter. So you need to think about this as a part of your operationalization of your compliance program. So how is it going to work in practice? And what did you need to know about that one? It's actually a balancing act here, because obviously if you record, for example, those firms, Maria mentioned they have a requirement to record everything, to surveillance it, to search it. You may not want to do that because you have no requirement for it. But on the other hand, you need to think through that, how this is going to work, because there is legal requirements. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to talk about legal issues here, but sometimes you don't want to have a record, and you don't want to retain it, and you certainly don't want to retain it too long if you're not required to do that. So, and this is the balancing act which you need to go through, but you can't ignore it, because if you don't do it, and that is what Maria said in the DOJ guidance, particularly from a US perspective, is if you don't have a record, you can't demonstrate that you're looking how people are behaving, what they're doing, then your compliance program is maybe deemed not working because you don't have control around it.
And Nick, do you have any thoughts as well here about how pressing of an issue this is?
I think it's probably not that pressing of an issue for most organizations. I think, 5 years from now, it'll probably look a lot different. Maybe 3 years, it'll look a lot different. I think, we'll probably get into this some more in a bit, but, do we have jurisdiction over these things, over these devices? I mean, we're kind of obligated to, at least for these trading firms. I think those are going to be sort of a canary in the coal mine to some degree. And the expectations are probably going to roll out across, other industries as time goes on. I think what it will probably lead to, though, is like some action to take right now is that, we expect all correspondence to sort of fall within our guidelines of like proper behavior or, our code of conduct or whatever. So, I mean, it's a difficult situation. Just, like I said, we'll probably talk about this some more in a moment. It's a difficult thing to manage because it's kind of outside, the jurisdiction, as I said, to the extent that the culture can be a prevention for, risk actually popping up in these areas, before it becomes like a regulatory issue, I think you can put yourself in a much better spot.
So I'm going to pick up on something you just said there, Nick, about the culture that is trying to handle this. I'll give some background for everybody on the enforcement we have seen so far. So actual enforcement actions from the Justice Department, Securities and Exchange Commission, and most recently the Commodity Future Trading Commission. They have taken, I think, at last total, about 30 banks and broker-dealers and financial firms have faced enforcement action here, some of them with significant penalties, usually in the range of several $100 million for a larger firm or several dozen $1 million for smaller firms. But they're all broker-dealer firms, because broker-dealers and related financial services, they have a specific rule that says you have to keep these records. And if they don't keep them, that's the violation. It doesn't matter that they weren't actually committing a crime with the messaging apps that they weren't supposed to use. It's just you were using off-brand messaging apps. That's it. That's enough of a violation right there.
Right.
But what struck me, getting back to the corporate culture point, is when you read the settlement orders, the thing that makes me wince is that there were a lot of supervisory and management employees who were also gabbing away on the messaging apps they shouldn't have used when they were supposed to be the role models for the junior employees. And here they were with other employees on WhatsApp or Snap or iMessages or whatever it was. In at least a couple of instances, it was compliance officers who it is your job to tell people not to do this. And when you're supposed to be encouraging them not to use the messaging apps and you're on the messaging apps yourself, that's a bad look. And it's always struck me that that sort of thing is what drives the regulators right up the wall. So I suspect they are using the broker-dealer firms as an example for everybody else. Also, there are some significant investor protection issues with the regulated firms, but it's a culture thing that looks the worst. And that's the sort of mistake any other company might make. And that struck me as like, that's the real important lesson here for other businesses. Maria, what do you think of my take here about, there's a culture flaw if you're engaging in this?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I agree with you. I read those two orders as well, and that struck me similarly. It was really surprising. And when I read the piece about compliance officers were actually also violating the rule, that really, you shake your head. When I was in the seat, the CCO seat, I wrestled with this issue. We had offices all over the world, and we had a policy that said, you cannot use these types of apps. And I had talked with our CISO, and we'll get into that a little bit later, I'm sure, in our conversation. But we made that decision. But in reality, I come to find out that the business on the ground in places like China and India and Russia, they were using them all the time. And so, that's a culture problem, right? That's, hey, why are you doing this? The rules say you can't. Managers were not preventing it. So yes, I completely agree with you. But, that's, stepping back for a minute, that's always how we want to couch our compliance programs, right? Is it part of the culture? Is it part of the DNA of the organization? And so, this struggle that we have, to Nick's point, it's very difficult to deal with these messaging apps. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later too. But that struggle, that challenge is just one part of the larger compliance program. And if I can, just for a minute, going back to the first question you put to me, two other things struck me about why corporate organizations should think about this. One is investigations. I conducted lots and lots of investigations globally. And you cannot conduct an investigation completely if there are communications happening outside of the system. The second is litigation, right? Your legal department is going to be worried about preserving business records, et cetera. So you have to have some approach to doing that for litigation reasons as well. So I just wanted to add that to my thoughts from before.
It's worth noting the firm that set off this, the very first one to face an enforcement action, was JP Morgan in late 2021. And if you read through that settlement order and the statement from the SEC, it's very clear the SEC had gone to JP Morgan to say, we're investigating this issue. Do you have any records related to it? And they said, no, we searched all through and we don't have anything.
Right.
Okay, thank you. They went to another bank and then said, we're looking for this. And the other one said, oh, yeah, we have all of these records. And there in the records was the other half of the conversation from JP Morgan, which just said it didn't have anything. Right. And it really complicated the SEC's investigations. You can almost see the steam coming out of the SEC Enforcement Division's ears when you read through their statements about that. And that alone, it seems to me that is a big threat. If there is an underlying offense somebody's investigating, and because of your poor attention to record keeping, you can't assist with that, that's going to leave the company in a very bad position. I also suspect there are many other regulators, state attorneys general and various others. One of the commenters here said they're from healthcare and said they worry about this all the time. Just because you are not a registered investment advisor with the SEC, that doesn't mean you can let this go out the window. That very much seems the case. We have a lot of people already diving in on the chat talking about devices and messaging apps and what we can or can't do. So I actually wanted to keep going with that and ask about some of the technology challenges here. And maybe I'll ask Mike first and then Maria and then Nick. Like, what do you think compliance officers should be doing to get their head around the tech end of this? Do we say, are we going to argue that the company should give company-sponsored devices to all employees? Do we have to sit down with a CISO to figure out we want to turn these controls on or these off? Like, how much do we get immersed in the IT technical controls to try and solve this? Mike, what do you think?
We need to have oversight. So the first thing is a compliance officer needs to understand the business activity and what he's exposed to. Maria said India, China is using, WeChat or whatever, and not drawing. So it's a matter of a fact that in these countries, we're using these tools. That is the culture out there. You can't judge that only from the US, you need to local. So you need to understand your business, and then you can start working through that and yourself understanding that one. From a controls perspective, compliance need to be part of the implementation of new tools. There's no doubt about that one. If you get a new tool, I'm bringing the example, when the pandemic just started in 2020, when I was at Cardinal, we switched from Skype for Business onto Teams. And that was, as that rolled out, you need to make sure that you're in the middle of that one, making sure that what is recorded under Skype is also recorded under Teams, because a complete new technology, you need the sign-offs of that one. And there needs to be a process. You almost need to be on the governing board where you sign off project and make sure that you understand the recording requirements, you can properly implement it. And then the other thing is what you need to work on your IT, you need to get reports from them, what tools are in use. So there are scans on the systems that you even understand what messaging apps are maybe there, because you can't be everywhere. Particularly in large organizations, you have, Cargill has a lot of people, but even if you have only a couple of hundreds, maybe even a couple of thousands, then the problem already is starting. And then, as I said before, it's really listening into businesses what the customers want. If you deal with people in Middle East or Africa who have cheap connections and they're using a certain messaging tab, you almost don't get around if you want to do the business. That is almost the decision you have to take. So, and then you need to work through that. So I think the connection with the chief information officer is absolutely important. And then obviously with the chief security officer in order to make this control happening. But you really need to get us compliance into the line of approvals for those apps.
And Maria, give me your take on this, or maybe even your experience on it. I met one compliance officer who said that they spent 7 hours on a weekend with their IT team going through the controls and the configurations for, a half a dozen apps or something, trying to get around it. Is that the sort of challenge that we have, or is there a better way to try and approach it?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the challenge we have. I did the same thing. I spent a lot of time with our chief information security officer when we were wrestling with this question, as far as, how do we deal with this? Do we have the resources? But to step back for a minute, Mike is absolutely right regarding, you need to assess what your business is doing and, what do they need? Which apps do they need? So the conversation is beyond just the CISO. It's talking with the business people, talking with others in the organization, HR, legal, absolutely, right? To have a cross-functional approach to handling the challenges from messaging apps. But the most important conversation, obviously, is with the CISO. There are some apps I understand that have backup capability or migration capability. So we would look at that. There was the ability to have employees back up whatever apps they were using on their own phones. The other approach we took is in those countries that I mentioned where the business said, look, we're using it because our customers are using it. So we're going to be cut out of business if we don't communicate this way. In those areas, we contemplated, well, do we give phones to everybody in those jurisdictions? And not necessarily everybody, but frontline people, customer-facing people, right? So that now you have control over the device, and it made it a little bit easier, too, to deal with some of the privacy issues, which we haven't even talked about yet, when you're talking about a corporate device. But yes, CISO, you better spend a lot of time with your CISO to figure out, what's going on and what the technical capabilities are, especially if you're like me and you don't have a technical background.
So, Nick, let me pull this back to you because I hear a lot of an undercurrent that business operations and compliance obligations, like we have to align all of those. And compliance has to be involved in discussing how the business actually operates. What are we going to do? What do the customers want? And I am still skeptical that some companies out there may not necessarily put compliance and the culture of compliance at the heart of what they want to do. What do you think?
I think that's right. I mean, think about if you're a wealth manager and you have this portfolio that you're managing, and you have 100 clients or 50 different clients. Those people are not necessarily going to be sending you emails to your. I mean, it's just not the way it's done, right? They're not sending emails to talk about trades or those other things. People communicate across a bunch of different things. Like I was talking with one person today, and it was on email, and then it was on Slack, and then it was on text. That same person, like the conversation just kind of kept moving, and that's, we're not regulated to that same degree, but it was like a little microcosm of this challenge of like the fluidity of communication, and if you're a trader, like I said, or a wealth manager, and your client is texting you, what are you going to do? You have to, those folks' number one priority is making their numbers, growing the portfolio, keeping those clients happy. It's difficult, I think. And I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about today. It's difficult to have everybody on the front lines who could potentially violate this thing prioritize compliance over everything else, especially if in their view, it's something benign, right? I have, this friend who is in this role, and one of the clients made one of his clients' wife made this really kind of crazy claim over text, and they kind of freaked out about it, and they went directly to the compliance officer and said, hey, there was like a, kind of this messy divorce going on, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, but she made all these kind of crazy claims, and they went directly to the compliance officer because that compliance officer has a really good relationship with them, and that compliance officer is very approachable, and they were very clear about like, this is in bounds, this is out of bounds, but like, they perhaps wouldn't have self-reported that if those circumstances weren't in place. And I think, whether you're a trading firm or not, I think this whole issue here is kind of a microcosm of this ongoing challenge that ethics and compliance has in, making sure that people are kind of staying in bounds, and to what extent people are prioritizing their own self-interest, whether that's making their numbers or getting the sale or dealing with the client, to what extent are those self-interests in conflict with what the rule of the land is, so to speak, and which of those ends up winning out. It's a really tough problem,
Mm-hmm. We have a bunch of people on the chat right now trying to debate how you decide, do we give the employees company-owned phones? Do we let them have personal phones with company apps that we monitor or not? How do we solve this? And Mike, I wanted also to circle back to you because we haven't yet talked about privacy obligations, and especially in Europe, they're going to be quite onerous. Could you unpack some of the privacy challenges around all of this for us, Mike, especially with the GDPR, but also, I don't know if you have any recommendations or thoughts about a company-owned phone for everyone, a personal phone with, that they use their personal apps or not, or how do we get this? But how do you think through some of these issues?
So let me unpack this a little bit and first address my personal view on own devices use.
Yep.
If I would have my word in it, I would just ban it completely, because you have so many challenges to get the controls in place around these devices. You don't own them, you get rights to scan them, but it's extremely difficult to enforce that. Now, the reality is that won't happen anymore because we have moved on from that point. That would be the point. I think the main working tool, a computer, should not be a private tool. The mobile phones are different, and then you're in this whole problem with how you monitor it, because the companies you can scam. So in the other comment you made about GDPR, for those who don't deal with Europe, it's a general data privacy rules or regulation in Europe that has just been expanded, or no, it's another 14 days into Switzerland. So the EU and Switzerland are covered in the future under virtually the same rules. So in Europe, you cannot record centrally or archive centrally email communication, written communication, unless you have the written consents of your employees and potentially the Works Council approval to do this. And even you would get that you absolutely not have the ability to scan them and surveil them systematically, similar to what you do in banks, for example. Even Deutsche Bank in Germany, for example, who is regulated by the local regulator, which is called BaFin, they're running into issues that they can't comply with their banking supervision rules because the data privacy is stronger than the banking supervision rules. So that is the way, so that I heard from one of the auditors I worked with, it's really a challenge, is data privacy rules. And then when you come into, there is no regulatory requirement under the law in Europe, then it gets very difficult to even record that. So an example I can give, which I'm aware of, is you have a registered firm in the US, actually a swap dealer, who is required under the law to do certain recordings. You can't do it in Europe for either written or verbal. Verbal is even more difficult in Europe. I wouldn't go into that one. So that is really a challenge, how you to deal with that one, and you need to find solutions, but it is a real challenge with the data privacy rules. And obviously, as the globe becomes more, fluent and those type of things, people moving around, there's a lot of things you need to consider, because not only Europe, there are other jurisdictions, but probably the strongest you find in Europe.
It's funny that you mentioned if you were in charge, you would just say company-owned devices, period. There's at least a few commenters here who also said they would prefer company-owned devices because they don't want to use their personal device. They don't want the company getting its hands into it. What if the personal phone has to be seized as part of an investigation? So, how do we make this work? Maria.
Well, who owns the app? Like, who owns the WhatsApp account? Who owns the Twitter account? You know what I'm saying? Even if it's a company issued phone, you know what I'm saying? Like, how do you actually solve it? How do you actually contain it? Like in actual, in the real world, it's, you know what I'm saying? Like, even if you have a company phone and you say, hey, here's a company email, here's a company phone with a company phone number, your company texts are going to be discoverable. If somebody installs WhatsApp on there, who owns that? Is it the employee who created that account, or is it the company? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's part of the policy, though, Nick. Like, you'd have to say, here's the company phone, you can't use it for personal. I mean, and we know they're going to anyway, but you got to have all those directions that come out and say you can't use this for personal use. And so if you upload one of those apps, you do it at the risk that the company says that's ours. That's ours. We're going to.
Yeah, but I don't think this whole issue is about people using a company device for personal use. I think it's people doing business on apps that are not sort of capturing the documentation that's required by the regulation. And so I'm just saying, even on that company thing, whether you go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, that is a different type of issue. So the company device at least allows me to scan it. It's much more likely that I'm able to put some controls around that device than on a personal device, because what we usually do today, according to the safety people, it's probably safe that we control the apps we give them, which they can access company data. The problem is the same telephone number, which privately is used for business, and they maybe use something completely different. We have no controls around it. So it's much more difficult to enforce that. But I absolutely agree with Maria. It's a framework you need to establish between policies, training, and then obviously controls on the processes, how you introduce new apps, and then obviously surveillance, which is difficult in some cases. But I think the whole framework needs to work. What you are saying is actually, are you even allowing to open WhatsApp accounts or Facebook accounts or Instagram accounts with a company email address? Yes or no? It's a question you need to address. And then it becomes a very interesting discussion. But the reason why I'm saying I would only allow company devices is actually, it's much easier for me to size this device and delete everything on there or something like that than on a private device. That's the sole reason for it. So, none of the other issues go away.
To give some sense of this, here's a quote directly from the Justice Department's guidance on messaging. One of the questions a prosecutor is supposed to ask is, what preservation or deletion settings are available to each employee under each communication channel, which is each app, and what do the company's policies require with respect to each? So if we have dozens of different categories of employees in dozens of different countries, and we have Lord knows how many apps, I can quickly see that this is blooming out into this gigantic tree of obligation that is going to be very difficult. Here is one statement here, somebody calling for it would be nice if regulators provided even more guidance. I think that is true. I did want to shift gears a little bit away from the technology itself, because we're never going to fully solve this problem. If an employee is determined to use a messaging app surreptitiously, they're going to find a way to do it. It's more about what is the effort the company is supposed to do to show regulators we are trying to take this seriously. Like, what should those messaging app policies contain? Maria, let me ask you that first, and then Mike, and then Nick. What do you think?
Well, like with everything else we talk about in compliance, they have to be risk-based, right, and targeted to your organization. So you have to have that understanding as you're sitting down to draft the document. You can't just take something that's off the shelf. And then, if you're going to allow it, you're going to accept the fact that people are going to communicate that way. There should be some consideration in your policy about what items, if you don't have technical controls, what items that are communicated about must then be documented on a corporate system, right? So is there a certain aspect of a deal that once you get to that point, it should be on the system? Like the example Nick gave about the customer complaint, essentially on the text. If there's a customer complaint on a text, you must, put it on our system so that we can preserve it for all time. Confirmatory emails should be sent. And this whole concept of migration and exporting, which I mentioned earlier, if whatever apps are going to be permitted have those capabilities, the policy needs to inform employees that they're going to have to do that. They're going to have to export the data, back it up, et cetera, on the company system, on a regular basis. So I think those are some of the basic things that should be included in a policy addressing this issue.
And Mike, what's your take on the ideal policy? What points does it touch on?
Yeah, it's similar to Maria. It's not much different. I think there is an additional point, which is escalation or question ask, how you go about getting approval, for example. And then I think in the policy, there are certain approvals for exceptions or how you deal with that and those type of things. There's some guidance how you deal with that. But in general, it's the same. So you don't want to give too much exceptions, because I think what we all need to consider with the policies is we write a policy today and we consider all the apps we have in use. Tomorrow, the next one comes up. It's more the next one launches, let's call it in Nigeria or in South Africa, and you have the same problem. Maybe it launched a week ago and you didn't know. So I think the policy need to have some flexibility to deal with situations. But in principle, what Maria said is it's very important. And then obviously also what the scope is, who is covered by it, and that is extremely important.
And Nick, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, about a good messaging policy, or I'll give you the choice about the responsibilities of supervisors and managers and how the company compliance function emphasizes to those managers, you have to be up here with your conduct, not down here with everybody else.
Yeah, and I just think it's so kind of idiosyncratic to the business and like the personality type of that manager. That's what's going to win out at the end of the day. And so kind of to circle back to the first question, I think the policy has to be kind of like full of teeth, I mean, like, let's put aside the risk of it kind of turning into just a dog and pony show and just like a check the box thing. Should we get in trouble? Hey guys, here's our policy, and look, we're doing everything we can. If we want this to actually be functionally right, we have to change those behaviors, which I think, that mood in the middle, or those sort of those managers and supervisors, as you said, Matt, their conduct and what they message to their team, no pun intended, and how they behave is probably going to be the strong force. And I think if those folks believe that if they violate this policy, they're actually going to get fired, or they're actually going to get, critically reprimanded, then you have a higher chance of that behavior kind of falling in line. I think, again, it's going to be a function of the industry and, maybe the culture of the country that you're in. There was a couple of questions in the chat of like, what do you do if you're in business with another country where the majority of everybody uses these apps? Like 85% of the people, you use WhatsApp. I mean, how do you get around that? We have to kind of set those good examples. And I just think, you at least need a policy that has some teeth, that, thinks through, some of the things that Maria and Mike were saying. Things need to be sort of documented in our system, encourage self-reporting and so forth. at least as like a, belt and suspenders or like as a safety net. But the way those people actually behave, to your point, Matt, I think is going to be the strong force on like the general sort of average compliance across the organization.
So I did want to pick up on something that you had brought up there, Mike, about holding people accountable and disciplinary actions. One thing that struck me, going back to the broker-dealers and their enforcement actions happened against them, is that all of the 25 or 30 or so now who have been sanctioned, all of them, for part of their settlement, they have to hire an independent compliance consultant, which sounds an awful lot like a compliance monitor to me under a different name. But one of the things that the monitor must do, or the compliance consultant with the companies, is they have to conduct extensive audits and looks at a disciplinary framework that the company uses for messaging violations. And there's detailed analysis of how often are people disciplined for not using the proper messaging apps. And is that discipline meted out consistently? Is it meted out sensibly? A more senior person gets a worse sanction than somebody else. It strikes me that disciplinary enforcement is very much intertwined with this talk about messaging apps and improving the corporate culture. So Maria, let me swing back to you. Talk to us a bit about that other stuff that has to go along with this, whether it's training, whether it's disciplinary actions, or other things to support the policy and the culture that we want to achieve. Maria, what should they be thinking about and doing? What should that look like?
Yeah, it's all of those things, Matt, right? So there absolutely needs to be training, but, I prefer to use the word education, right? So you need to educate, your employees and your managers about why this is important, right? They need to understand, and you have these great cases. You got the Morgan Stanley case, you got the JP Morgan case. Everybody understands fines. Everybody understands reputational damage, right? So if you can make it, you can explain it. And I don't think it's just, sort of your code of conduct, off-the-shelf training. I think there needs to be specific education on these issues. You get a bunch of managers in a room and you have a discussion like we're having here. Communications, newsletters, emails, et cetera, to educate. And then the other piece is exactly what Nick said. There needs to be teeth. You could have the best policy in the world. You could have all the education, training, and communication available to you and have executed on it. But if it's a big so what, when people are violating the policy or doing something that is at odds with what you're trying to educate folks on, and they get there's no consequence, people are just going to continue to behave in this way. And that will cause significant risk to the organization. And so you do have to have teeth. You have to discipline people. That was a problem I had when I was the CCO in this global organization, and it was happening in China. We decided, again, I told you, the CISO and I said, okay, we're not going to allow it. And it was happening anyway. You got to monitor. That's the other piece, right? You have to monitor for compliance with that policy. But the discipline is key. People need to understand that the company takes it seriously, and you are going to lose your bonus. You're going to, get fired. Whatever it is, a letter in your file, I don't know. It'll have to be commensurate with the level of the violation, of course, and whether or not it was a mistake or was with malice aforethought. But that's really the key. And the DOJ is expecting that, right? The guidance, the 2023 guidance talks about discipline. How is it meted out? Is it fair? Is it applied equally? Are senior people getting, less severe punishments than middle managers and below? You can't have that. There needs to be organizational justice. And so as people are thinking this through in their organizations, when they go back to their offices, those are the types of things that I would be looking at, if I were still in the seat.
Sure.
Yeah, if I can add briefly.
Yeah.
I would say the ultimate thing is compliance with messaging, and compliance in general needs to become part of the performance goals of the commercial people and the people who are putting the company at risk. If it is only the goal to sell as much derivatives as possible, it's only the goal to make much trading results as possible, and that is not part of their goals, that will never get their intention there needs to be. So I think that is all together. And one more comment is, I think there needs to be consistency in the disciplinary action, Actually, depending what size you have, you probably need to have some kind of a board, if that is an internal governance board or whatever, who is deciding on those, and they have a systematic approach to it. And if that is your top trader who constantly violates, he needs to get the same punishment. Somebody who is not performing or is not as important for the company. And that may means ultimately that you have to terminate a contract with somebody who is really well performing, but he's putting the company at the back end at risk.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of people who have written in talking about this, who said that, yes, they have fired people for violating their messaging policy. Nick, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the importance of this for a good corporate culture, the importance of consistency and discipline. And I'm really also interested in the messages you give to the supervisory people and the managers. It's not just don't use the messaging apps. It's more like, you're supposed to be the leader. And how do we get that message to the supervisory people about why them setting a higher standard is so important? How do you crack that nut?
Well, I think it's, this is just like sort of one application of this principle that, leaders should be held to a higher standard. The average employee's interaction with the organization is oversampled by their interaction with that leader. And, if you're running a team, your team sets the clock by you, by your mood, by your attitude, by what you value and so forth. People can read into that. And I think, we run the risk with this particular policy in turning it into, like I said, that sort of dog and pony show thing where it's like, we don't believe we can actually do anything about it. So we just have to sort of slap this policy up and say, here's the policy. In case we ever get in trouble, we can point to it. I think if you do that, you end up kind of running the risk of saying like, okay, well, this policy matters and this one doesn't, which then can lead to kind of managers or anyone kind of picking and choosing which ones they think the company actually cares about, which is a super dangerous spot to be in. So I think reinforcing that message to leadership kind of across the board that like you're held to a higher standard. It's your job to set an example for your team on a professional basis, from a compliance basis, from an ethical basis, whatever. And really, forcing them to live that out. If that's not part of, the annual review process for these folks, or that's not part of the constant feedback for these folks, the extent to which they're living out the company values or setting that right example, you're really opening yourself up to like, fractalized risk across the organization because people can just go all over the place. And like I said, personal goals often can be justified, at least internally, as a reason to, not follow a certain rule. And so holding those folks to a higher standard is super critical. And that should be kind of a foundational element of your corporate culture, regardless of the policy in question.
So just to give attendees and listeners a sense of some of the background here, Maria had mentioned the good case of Morgan Stanley. I wanted to fill in people on that. So Morgan Stanley, the detail I saw about them is that this was written about in the Financial Times. They had tied together their disciplinary policy for messaging with employee bonuses and payments. So yes, if you violated the messaging policy, you might well see some of your pay or your bonus docked. And up to more senior bankers at Morgan Stanley could potentially face a loss of $1 million in equity awards and bonus compensation for repeated violations of the messaging policy. And even for fat cat bankers, I'm sure losing $1 million, like that's going to sting. So I've always thought that Morgan Stanley gets it, that, the different levers you're supposed to pull to achieve this outcome. But you need supportive HR for that. You need at least to communicate to employees, this is what we're doing about messaging, and they might not agree with it. It seems like there's a lot of moving pieces that you have to line up to get the right compliance effort in place. Maria, I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, the challenges of getting all the rest of the enterprise on your side for this.
Yeah, I mean, as Nick and Mike have alluded to, it's the same challenge as with any other aspect of the compliance program, right? And it does all go back. We started at culture. We're going to end at culture. It all goes back to the culture in the organization. I worked, at Cushman & Wakefield for 10 years. And while I was there, I worked under 4 different CEOs. And, I reported to the global general counsel and sat up at that level. So I contacted the CEO frequently. And, one of those 4 CEOs was very much a supporter of what I was doing and my efforts. In fact, he changed my title from chief compliance officer to chief ethics officer because he really understood it's more than about, box checking and dealing with rules and regs and all of that. And when I worked under his leadership, it felt like a different culture than under some of the other CEOs. And so, that's really the key to some of this. What is the culture in your organization that comes? And I hate the phrase tone from the top, but what is the culture and the level of support for all of the things compliance officers are doing within an organization from above? And if you don't have that from above, it is going to make these types of difficult situations even more difficult. So culture is super important.
So Rosemary just asked a question that I think dovetails perfectly on what you're talking about. She said, how do you accomplish something similar to Morgan Stanley when those at the top have already said that they're going to continue to use the messaging apps? How can you get them to agree to such a penalty, the teeth that takes away bonuses that Matt was talking about? Like, I'd love to kind of chew on that. Like, how do we get actually tactical here? And how do you overcome that? Or is that just an insurmountable challenge,
It depends, I would say it that way. So I think compliance should have a reporting line into the board. So if the CEO or the C-suite in general is not agreeing with you, you need to have a conversation. It's also risk assessment as well. As we said before, I think it would be not advisable to ignore these fines, irrespective of which industry you are, but you need to think through what are your risks. So, and there might be a risk assessment you need to do, and also getting to the point to get agree. But ultimately, yes, if the C-level, the C-suite is not helping you, there's the last resort is your connection to potentially in the board to get that rectified. And or, but before you go there, you sit down with them and go through some of these public fines, some of these guidance, and explain them why it is important, and then you come to a conclusion how you get there where you need to be. That are the step before, but it's a difficult, it's a serious process. I mean, Maria has probably more experience than in that in my area, but I think it's a very difficult discussion. But there are things you need as compliance, you need to push, and if you don't get it in the first place, you need to continue to work on it.
Maria, what do you think about this?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, all the things that Mike just said, you need to have a line into the audit committee, and I did when I was at Cushman, and they were publicly traded, and I reported quarterly and all that, and I had a great relationship with them. But if you don't have that, because maybe you're not a public company or what have you, you do need to have a very good relationship with your CEO, the president, whoever leads the organization. And one of the ways that, I learned to do that under the CEO to which I'm referring is, he said to me when I was expressing to him the problems I was having with some of the culture and the compliance issues, et cetera, he said to me, Maria, it's about people. It's about people and about relationships. And what you need to do is you just need to go and you need to sit down with them and have a cup of coffee and have a conversation. And I did that. I went over to China and spent several days over there, and I sat in a conference room and I had people coming in and out every 20 minutes or whatever. And I found out about a lot of things that were going on there that I needed to address. And, the way that I was able to do that was just in a very disarming kind of way, having a conversation with a cup of coffee. And as Mike said, educating them on why the things that I was talking about are important to the organization and frankly to them as an employee, because the health of the company is important to an employee. They're a stakeholder, right? And so if you can create that line of communication, that channel of communication with your senior C-suite leaders, that will go a long way. Now, I've also been in situations in which, in my very long career, where I've tried and I've tried and I tried, and the people that were in those seats just weren't hearing it. And then you have to make a personal decision as to whether or not, you need to make a change in your profession. I mean, really, it does come down to that. But if you're able to break through, and because you've connected with them, that goes a very long way and will help you in your compliance program and your compliance efforts.
Mike, I just wanted to pick up on one point you had made about the risk assessment that has to happen here to persuade the company, we have to do this, even if some employees might not like it. We could draw a distinction between the broker-dealer firms where their risk is constant. They have a rule. If they violate it, that's enough. That's all that has to happen. For every other firm out there, going back to why others should care about this, it probably is true that the risk is less frequent, but when you step on that landmine, it's probably going to be a worse explosion, because for you, there is an underlying crime the regulator is investigating, and then they find out you had incomplete records, and then they find out, well, the compliance officer was trying to have a good policy that others said they just weren't going to bother with. Like, I don't want to be that company. That looks awful. And the regulators would probably get right up in the company's face over that. That is, so there's still various ways that, even when it's coming back to a risk assessment, this can be a really big risk when it finally comes back.
So make sure you're having those conversations with your CEO on WhatsApp or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Mike, what were you going to say?
No, I just want to say, I mean, the risk assessment here will lead to the question, what is a proper risk mitigation? So you will identify that the ultimate risk is unlikely to happen, but if it happens, it's a huge problem for you, and it can shut down the company. It's depending what the investigation is. So in particular, the investigators maybe have something in their hand, what you explained in the other case of JP Morgan. They didn't have the records, somebody else had the records. So they're getting into trouble with that one. So I think what I'm saying with risk assessment, you need to think through that. What is the potential risk mitigation? How you can allow the company or the business to do what they need to do, but you have proper risk mitigation in place so that the risk, if somebody steps on that mine, unlikely, but it could happen, that you can manage that risk at that time. So, and one other comment I want to make about Maria, what she said, absolutely what I talked before is the ultimate ratio. The thing we need to look at is that as a compliance officer, I need to have very good, strong, trusted relationship with all business people, not only with the CSO. At all levels, I need to have that. But through that relationship, I can persuade potentially. But ultimately, what Maria said, if you can't, and you have a risk as a compliance officer, that is the risk of a compliance officer. That is unfortunately one of the risks in our professions you may need to go.
So we have time for maybe one more question I want to try and sneak in, because this was a good one that somebody asked. What if you are monitoring the messaging apps and you come across some questionable content, and not necessarily evidence of a legal violation, but the employees are talking about, the senior VP is convincing the pretty young intern to go out for drinks after work or something like that. Something you weren't necessarily looking for, and it's not related to record keeping, but you suddenly know a compliance issue or an ethics issue that you can't unaddress it. How should companies think that through? Maybe Maria, if you want to take a minute, and then Mike take a minute, but how often do you encounter something like that? What would you do?
Yeah, I've actually encountered that when I was the CCO for the broker dealer entity I referred to earlier. I was doing the review that you're required to do by FINRA, and I came across something along the lines of what you just described that involved some fairly senior people in the organization. So it was even more sensitive. And what I did was I went to the general counsel. And I sat with him and I explained to him what I came across and how I thought that it posed a risk with respect to, sexual harassment or whatever the issue was that I had seen. And then, he took it from there. Ironically, he was already aware of it and apparently was looking into it. But that's what I did. I felt that I could not ignore it. So I raised it to the GC.
Mike, any other advice there about inadvertent discovery?
GC or there are. So one of the things you need to have is in that area, not in the compliance that we talked about, but generally speaking, you need to have an investigation policy, the way how you handle with those type of things, how you go about it. You need very quickly in those type of situations legal protection, because you can get in all kinds of trouble if you don't have attorney privilege on it, so that it gets spilled out. So I would exactly say what Maria said. You go to your general counsel and get that organized for the review or whatever the procedure says, but you need to deal with that in a proper way.
All right. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, because this has been a great session. But Maria Davanzo and Mike Hallback, thank you both very much for giving us all your perspective. And Nick, if you have any other closing thoughts here, you can bring it home.
Yeah, thank you. This was an awesome session. I hope you guys got some value out of this. We take very seriously the time that you spend with us every single week. Free CEUs, of course, those will be coming out. Replay is going to be available, of course, as always. Join us next week. This is going to be a real treat. At Impact last year, or Impact earlier in the year, there was this awesome session, and we're kind of recreating it with a little Ethicsverse twist. We got Pat Nazzo, Nancy Higgins, Gretchen Winter, and the one and only Twinkle Toes himself, Joe Murphy, coming, talking about how to climb the ladder. So hope you guys can join us next week. It's really going to be a phenomenal episode, our pre-show. If that's any indication for what's coming, hope you guys will join us. And thank you all for coming, and we will see you all next week. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.